engage because you think that there's no point in even voting, no point in raising awareness about the cause that you are fighting for, because there is no way for you to improve because of the cynicism that exists. But second, we think that political candidates are going to say things like, these are the problems with these are the problems that exist with the right. So the reason that you think vote left is not because you as the left have good solutions. It is because you are not as bad as the right. On our side, you give the solutions that you are trying to implement when you get elected. And the reason this is important is because when either side points out the problems and no solution actually comes through, you don't think that there is any hope left, or that people or that politicians are just going to keep bickering and no one is actually going to offer solutions. On our side, you see the kinds of changes that are being brought in society, and therefore you feel more like enthusiastic about engaging with that. Second part of this argument on why optimism increases political engagement. First, we think there is specificity in the kinds of solutions that we talk about. Why? On-site opposition, you only point out the broad problems that exist, but you don't engage with the solutions for those problems. On our side, the end impact is getting to the public a kind of solution that they would want to have. And this means that the public is better able to interpret what that kind of solution is, and they want to go towards that solution. Whereas on their side, you are not really sure what you need to follow or what to do, but on our side, we're able to give you that direction. What are the impacts of this? First, we think that people partake in more elections and engage more with political systems. So this means that you vote on all levels, like the municipal level, like the central government level. Second, we think we drive political engagement to things like people showing up to campaigns and rallies to support the kinds of solutions that they want to see implemented. And third, we think people also participate in civic ventures, for example, signing petitions. On to the second claim then, on how there's more effective political discussions on our side. The first part of this argument is why apathy has created two political discussions on their side. One, we think that pessimism targets every single problem that is out there. And the reason this is bad is because people think that now there are just too many problems for you to deal with. This means that even if an issue is important, it gets crowded out by the other issues that are prevalent. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
The left has tried this for years with Harris and Clinton and whatnot, and has clearly failed. Why is this time any different?
This is because in the current political scenario, the right wing is trying to be extremely pessimistic. And we think that the Democrats have a strong advantage right now if they choose to go ahead with optimistic policies, because they can feed on the rancor against the right wing. Here are the reasons why we think that you are politically apathetic on their side. You don't care, you're not able to care about all of the issues that exist because people are just telling you that there are an infinite number of problems, and you simply don't have the capacity to be able to care about them so fully that it places an emotional burden on you. But B, we think that you participate less actively for each and every one of those problems. For example, even if you do participate to some extent about what immigration is like, but there are 5 other problems that they are pushing onto you pessimistically, we think you are less likely to go to things like rallies or sign petitions, and more likely to do simpler things like go out on social media and express your concern. Secondly, we think that on our side, there is a deep we think that on our side, because you are not talking about every single pessimistic issue, you are able to achieve a state where certain issues where you do talk pessimistically are far better. What do we mean by this? Because you don't make it seem like the world is ending every day. When you do say things like this is a certain problem that we need to fix, people actually listen to that problem. People are cognizant of that problem because it shuts out the white noise and the background noise that exists on side opposition. What are the impacts of this? First, we think there is an increasing amount of political discussions and bargaining power that exists with left-wing politicians. This is to say that you are able to get a few big changes rather than a bunch of little changes. The reason this is true is because now you are able to show people what really matters, and you do this through your messaging, not just and you do this through the quality of the messaging that you are doing. That is optimism, instead of just saying that there are so many problems, how will we fix them all? On those grounds, we are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the first talk for the final remarks, continuing and opening the opposition bench. First up. first out.
Hi, can everyone see and hear me? Wonderful.
Yeah, visible.
For decades, mainstream elites on the left have pushed narratives of hope and change in the face of excessive bureaucracy, in the face of ravages of neoliberalism and more inequality than ever that happened under their watch. The left has asked its electorate to trust the system once more for the past few decades. But the system if the system ought not to be trusted, then we will not keep up the lie we are very proud to oppose. In setup, we believe that left-wing political candidates should prioritize cynical over optimistic messaging about the political system. One, what does cynical and pessimistic messaging look like? We want to emphasize that this clearly does not equate to believing that the political system is just inherently flawed in nature and that there's nothing that you can do to change it, right? So we reject the characterization that they give us that we think is incredibly reductive. We think clearly on either side, democracy and a political system is just necessary for your political life to function. Rather, this is about believing that the people in power should not be blindly trusted, or believing that large safeguards need to be put in place in order to fix a political system as it is. So it might manifest in the form of just fearing undemocratic outcomes or illiberalism because individuals are not inherently optimistic about the ability of the political system to preserve its health. Comparatively, their world is one in which individuals believe that the political system is fine and can hold up on its own. Second, how does this rhetoric manifest? We think there are two types of rhetoric that occur. So their side is only willing to talk about very minute circumstances in which this occurs, right? We think the more likely scenario of this happening is one, in terms of the system itself. So it's about the institutional safeguards and the ease of being illiberal. On our side, people are more cynical about the propensity for things like gerrymandering. Second, it's about political and social change. So it affects whether or not you believe that in an ideal political system, you can vote for a party of your choice and will be fairly represented, or whether in practice you believe that everybody's votes do really matter equally. Last, how do we think right-wing politicians will react? Because we think there's a very big part of the debate that you just aren't willing to talk about. It is factually true that many people are disillusioned with the state of democracy today. On their side, right-wing politicians can attack you for being out of touch with reality, precisely because of the reason that they tell us of how these right-wing politicians are the ones who are very pessimistic in nature. That is why these politicians have been succeeding, because people recognize that they are the ones who better understand and better support them. With that, let's take down their case. Their first argument is that they increase political engagement because cynicism is something that pushes people to just give up. I want to flip this in a few ways. One, we think it's just factually true that the right wing is ahead of you. It is factually true that they are across the world just gaining a lot of traction, that more people are voting right-wing powers into politics, which means that if you are a left-wing supporter, you are going to be cynical anyway. You are going to not believe that the parties that are in power right now are doing things for you, which is why they don't turn out to vote, which is why the left-wing parties are not being voted in anyway. And when the left wing goes up and says, no, all our policies are perfect, no, what we're doing is very good, then that's what turns the people away on their side. So we flip their biggest impact. But second, I want to deadlock break this. One, I think you have an increased incentive on our side to do voting and participation because you believe that this is a system that's inherently flawed. So you believe that the only way for you to change those forms of things is for you to actually turn up, right? That the best means for you to do those forms of things is for you to go and vote. And when they say that it's going to be like things that you and they say it's going to things like you're just pointing to a problem. This is obviously not what we're going to stand for. What we stand for is probably a middle ground. What these politicians are going to do is probably say that, this system is flawed, our solutions might not be the most perfect, but we need you to vote so that we're able to get some form of change, even though the system is something that might not work out in the end. So on their side, comparatively, that is when you turn towards complacency because you believe it is something that's very easily solved. But second, we want to note that precisely for a mechanism that tells on right-wing pessimism, it's precisely because of this case that the right-wing powers are getting into power, which is why you need to be able to counterbalance against that on our side. Second argument they give us, they tell us about this whole thing on emotional burden. We want to observe that, we want to observe that it's also very emotionally burdening for you to deeply believe in optimism in the political system when you don't actually see that happening around you. When you look around you and you see institutional failures, that is when you turn away from the system because you believe there's nothing you can do to change it. With that, we bring to you two arguments. One, we mobilize support for the left-wing politicians. Second, we lead to better forms of political change. First argument, we mobilize support for left-wing political candidates. The premise of this argument is that we are currently in a system that is failing, and therefore it's very important for left-wing political political candidates to be grounded in what happens in reality. I just want you to observe, look around the world around us, right? That the past decade has meant a lot of undemocratic things have happened. It is things like gerrymandering in constituencies. That means it's not really one man, one vote. That if you are in a swing vote, you hold so much more power than someone who is living in a safe seat. You want to consider how policies have affected that affect people are just not responsive to democratic call-outs from the ground, right? That the Chevron doctrine means that you're able to make decisions based on things like food stamps for urban poor when they don't actually get say in those sorts of things. That, for instance, there are 2 or 3 strong parties across the world that in many different countries just means that they act to the exclusion of smaller parties, which means that people just don't get any form of democratic representation on their side. Second, even if you buy that people have increased short-term hope, that hope is something that fades. That's very difficult for you to keep hoping into the long term when you don't actually see those realities around you. That means that it's going to be far worse on their side because the left wing has now promised you something that they're unable to keep towards. Given this, we think it's far better when your messaging is something that seems in touch, which is what we're able to get on our side. Why is this the case? 1, we think people just increase support of left-wing politicians. That when your messaging seems far more in touch, then that is when people actually believe that the left wing is something that represents them. That the reason why so many people turned away from left-wing parties in the first place was because they thought that they were too liberal, was because they thought that they were stuck in their ivory towers, was because they thought that they were university-educated white elites. That is the precise messaging that the right wing was able to use against them. And when you use things like optimism on your side, that is when the right wing will co-opt this sort of messaging. They will say once again that the left wing does not represent you. The left wing does not understand you. The left wing is rich and white, and you as a black mother living in the inner city is going to be fundamentally unrepresented. Second, we give people more realistic expectations. I want to observe, just empirically, it's very difficult for you to get change. So don't buy into the idealistic world that they want to tell you on proposition. That you voting in one election doesn't mean that you're going to change the outcome necessarily. That it's very difficult for bills to even pass because you have to go through, for instance, Senate subcommittees, then the House, then the Senate, then you have to avoid a veto, which means it's very difficult for these sorts of things to be passed. On their side, that is when your hope is crushed. That's when you're disillusioned. That's when you opt out of the system. Comparatively, we are far more realistic on our side. We temper people's expectations. Second argument, we lead to better forms of political change. This argument uniquely takes them at their best. Even if you buy that optimism means that more people buy in, that buy-in is going to be counterproductive in nature. What are the reasons for this? 1, I think when people are blindly optimistic, that's when they don't do things like strategic voting that will actually help them. That, for instance, if you are a French citizen who buys into the Green Party, you know that you will say, for instance, only get 8%. Okay, I'll take you.
If pessimistic messaging talks about how difficult it is to bring change and far less if this change happens, why will people keep listening to pessimistic messaging?
Look, pessimistic messaging isn't just going to be about how it's difficult for you to get change, right? You can say it is true that this change is not going to be happening fast. That is why we need you to keep turning out to vote. That is why we need you to do things like vote in primaries, to do things like go on the ground and help us out with campaigning, to do things like give us donations as a small party so that we're able to compete. All of these are instances of pessimistic messaging they are unwilling to talk about on your side. We think at the other side that doesn't deal with the full spectrum of instances this happens. Given this, we think individuals are more likely to turn towards less strategic voting because you believe that this party is going to do well, even when it would be more logical for you to vote for a party that, say, for example, just a mainstream left-wing party, so that you weed out the right. But second, you place blind trust in politicians, that you believe that these politicians know what they're doing, that you believe that all the lies that they're feeding you are truths, which means that you don't do things like grassroots activism that might help to complement things like the state is putting out, which we get on our side. Given this, we think that you act in more counterproductive natures on their side. Why do we fix this? 1, just trivially, you are able to hold politicians more accountable. Whether it's on the left, whether it's on the right, you are able to hold these politicians accountable because you don't believe blindly in what they're doing. But second, you do things that are just far more strategic for you and getting the left-wing politicians in. Change only comes from recognizing a problem we are very proud to oppose.
We'd like to thank the first opposition for the fine remarks. Continuing, I'd like to welcome second prop. Second prop.
Cool. Can you clearly hear me and see me?
Yeah. I can hear you, I can see you.
All right. The world has multiple problems, Yes. But the question within this debate was how you went about solving those problems. Do you say that the entire system has to be abolished because there is no hope in actually saving it? Or do you try and work within the system itself? We thought one was just far more plausible than the other, which is why it was just far more effective. Bunch of questions I want to ask. Firstly, on the top, what does this rhetoric look like? We tell you in first that they can see that people are currently cynical, which is why you have to have hopeful messaging. If people are already cynical about the political system, and the thing that you tell them is that the political system is not working, then I hardly think that it's actually leading to change because people are already apathetic and status quo. They do not think that the system can be changed. So it is unlikely that on any side of the house, they're going to agree that you completely gut the system and you go into some authoritarian state. What is far more likely is that people just disengage from the political system. They no longer do things like voting. Even if they do not give actual consideration to the sorts of parties that they're voting in. This is what made it far more effective for the left wing to actually get changed. I'll take you in a bit. And the simple reason as to why you will still point out problems on our side of the house is because obviously we recognize that different countries have like different problems that they're facing. If there's a broader economic problem that exists, you will still want to go ahead and fix it. If things like gerrymandering are a problem in the United States, the way that the left wing now phrases it is that we will go ahead and do things like the gut the bill if you vote us in. This is all quite important because it means that you can reverse the horrible changes that the right wing has done. The big thing I want to talk about is what does the right wing's current narrative look like, and why are we able to better take them on? The first thing is just that they also concede this, but it is largely pessimistic. It is about things like the immigrants are taking our jobs, etc. It is, and the solutions that they have are largely the solutions that they have do not make sense. It is things like we should just make sure that no one else. I'll take you in a bit. It is things like we should just make sure we're able to do things like mass deportation. If you use logic, you see why this is just simply not the solution. So the way that you actually compete with the right wing and the way you're able to get people on the fence to vote for you is not by saying there is a problem, but rather by saying we just have a better solution. Because currently the right wing has quite bad solutions to a lot of the problems that they talk about. If Trump talks about things like affordability, it is empirically true that he has actually contributed more to the budget deficit. These are reasons as to why you're able to better mobilize better solutions and therefore get people to actually talk about these solutions and why they were just so much better. You're able to counterbalance these narratives to the greater degree. But second, let us say that the right wing does believe that you have to gut the entire system. We are unclear on why the left wing has to co-opt that. If that is the case, and both of you agree that you have to gut the entire system, the problem is now you give more power to the right wing, which means you end up having worse governance. You end up doing things like you end up giving them more space to do things like democratic backsliding. We thought a counterbalancing narrative was quite important. What is the case that we get out of others? We never actually get a direct response to this. We tell you that you have a better solutions-based approach on our side. You will still call out problems, yes, but the way that you end up going about pushing these to voters is by talking about the solution. And we tell you, even in our best case scenario, let us say that everything that they say about pessimism, I'll take you in a second, everything that they say about pessimism is true. The problem then is just that when you use it more sparingly and you give more urgency to it, you are better able to solve the problems. So even taking them at their best, what happens is when you emphasize two big problems, such as this is happening and this is leading to democratic backsliding, that is when you're actually able to mobilize people on the ground. On the comparative, you just go, there are a bunch of these problems and you talk about all of these problems, but A, you never actually give them a solution to change, but B, you just have compassion fatigue because you have so many different problems being listed out and people are unclear about how they change it. When you use it sparingly, it just becomes so much more effective, and this is quite important. But also, we just think the left wing is now far more effective. There are two big reasons for this. The first is just that the way that this happens is a joint effort by the left. So the way it has currently happened is an incredibly fragmented approach where some parties use pessimism and the others use like optimism. So you're now able to consolidate the left. But more importantly, think about the spectrum on which this exists. Far more extreme left-wing parties will now say that we have to overhaul the system, but it's obviously politically unpopular. On the comparative, you're able to like consolidate the left as a larger movement to go ahead and fight against the right. You're able to do things like have more parties that actually talk about the solutions to this, and even the most extreme left-wing parties do agree that these solutions have to be done. When you have the same amount of messaging, you were able to consolidate the left, and that was a good thing. But then it is also the case that empirically, the way that the solutions approach has worked is effective. Look at the US under the Obama administration. They were dealing with large crises during that time, but you were still able to go ahead and have effective change. You did not blame it on the system itself. You rather had actual policies, because blaming it on the system did not do anything. When you had actual policies to go ahead and counteract that, that is what was actually effective. Even in our worst case scenario, perhaps it is the case that people cannot go on the street and protest. But what we're able to do is able to get the current apathetic youth voters to go onto the ground and start and do things like voting. And this was a big change, because when you were able to vote in a better party, you gave them the space to be able to do things like remove the bad policies that was done by the previous administration. Before I go on, sure.
So you concede the right wing is cynical, you concede people are cynical, you also concede that people are voting in the right wing. Do you think there's a link there?
If people are cynical and the right wing is cynical, the way that you end up telling people that we have not all hope is by telling them that there is scope to change. We just do not think if people were cynical and the right wing is cynical, they automatically vote for the right wing, because the problem is perhaps there are problems in society, but you want those problems solved. You don't want to live in a world that has a completely collapsed political system where you don't have right. It is when the Democrats tell you, guys, don't worry, we still have things like democratic institutions. And if you vote us in, here are the bunch of things that we will do to solve this, that you actually want to go ahead and vote for them. This just did not make any sense. But the last thing that they tell you is that you perceive them to be far more elite. We are unclear on why this is the case, but rather it is the case that when you have when you actually go ahead and talk to people about why the system still has scope to change, that the average person just feels far more included. Because currently the way that pessimism works is that you give them high level things on why the system itself is messed up, which people just cannot create any change in. It was far more important that you actually give them actionable things. To conclude, maybe perhaps it is true that there are lots of problems in society, but we could not solve them all by just listing out the problems. When you had a small number of problems, actually talked about the solutions to them, that is when it was just far more effective, because that is when you were actually able to concentrate on how to solve these problems. And it is also the case that the world is simply not that bad. So you were able to tell people that it is not to the point where we are in a dystopia. There is still scope for change, and that scope was quite good, which is why we are so incredibly proud to propose.
Okay, we'd like to thank the second prop for the fine remarks, continuing second op.
So both sides agree that there is a problem in the status quo. Democracy is disappointing because often democratic institutions are not truly democratic. In light of this, I want to ask questions. First, what sort of messaging is more likely to spur people to engage in political action in support of the left? Second, what type of change is more durable? The second question is our entire second argument that receives absolutely no response, so I'll unpack this later in the round. First, what is more likely to spur people to change? The first question I want to ask is to frame the context of left-wing parties right now. The reason there's been a rise of right-wing populism is because, in effect, previously left-wing parties were dominantly centrist. Think about the consensus Blair and Clinton, for example, that we need to engage in neoliberalism, that we need to be pro-market, for example. Look at the fact that Blair sustained the pit closures of 1980s even after Thatcher was gone, which deeply hurt ordinary coal miners on the ground and massively sapped support from working class individuals in the UK. This means that the reasons shift and the left has been spurred by low trust, and low trust in these political parties, which has told ordinary individuals on the ground that low taxes for billionaires are okay, even though these low taxes right now is the reason for why there are failing social services in light of the fact that you have crises like COVID-19 and oil shocks that hurt individuals on the ground. So the framing you should believe here is that ordinary people are mistrustful of left-wing political parties, which means that the convincingness of this messaging is probably going to be low on both sides of the house. People start off being skeptical. In light of the fact that people start off being skeptical, why is it the case that we are likely to ensure that people buy into the left given that people are already skeptical? Here's what I want to do with their first claim, which is that people are already cynical, so we shouldn't reinforce this. I think you're just playing a word game here. Obviously, on our side of the house, it's not as if we're reinforcing it and making people feel bad about themselves. Often what happens is we validate these concerns, because independent of whether or not the left-wing political party which you're mistrustful of is telling you that your life really, really sucks, the point is people can see it on a daily basis. The fact that there are no offices set up in order for them to apply for welfare checks, for example. These things mean that people know their lives are terrible. This means that it's very important for the left-wing party to gain the trust of individuals by saying, I know about your concerns. This is the reason why there's been a rise of the Republican Party, because ordinary black mothers were disillusioned by the Democratic Party that said they cared about black mothers, they cared about reducing crime, but did nothing at all to solve issues like broken windows policing that hurt these kinds of inner-city communities. So on our side of the house, we validate these concerns. It is important to be these concerns if they are trivial, because left-wing parties have such low trust right now. Second, we are obviously not saying that you can't do anything about your conditions. What we are doing is we are realistic about what you can do about your current suffering and condition. Also, language is very hyperbolic, right? They say you become less engaged because you believe you cannot change. Probably what the left-wing party says is, if you vote me in this election, for example, I cannot guarantee rent freezes, because empirically Mamdani has not been able to guarantee rent freezes, and it's unclear at all whether or not rent freezes or free buses are things he could do. That is out of the purview of his control, given the way in which the city council is structured in the US. The fact that this is something that's not repeated in places like California with jungle primary systems, where, for example, city council different arms of the political system. So on our side, it's probably what tell people that you're realistic about what you can do. You say to people, for example, if you vote me in, you will not save your life overnight. I will not ensure that your milk cartons will be instantly cheaper. But what I can tell you is that I will try my best in this process, that we are in this together and that we know there's a problem that we need to do something about. So clearly we are better for this in a low trust framing context I've explained at the top. Second claim they give, they say that on their side of the house they will focus on solutions. Here's where I want to push out my third argument to take this down. If you accept that on both sides of the house, certain left-wing individuals will vote for left-wing parties anyway, the question is getting left-wing individuals on the flank or certain right-wing individuals back onto your side. We think solutions, by virtue of the fact they are more minute, are far more divisive. How does a liberal like Matthew Iglesias, for example, square off with what Mandani says about rent freezes, for example? How do you square off the different interests of pro-business or anti-business interests within the Democratic Party? How do you square off between whether or not you believe AI should be controlled by the government or not? These are a range of issues which we concede, even if solutions are more minute on their side of the house, are far more divisive. Here's an additional flip for why we are more likely to get voters on the right. I really want to explain why what they say in setup cuts them. In setup, they say very proudly that they will glorify existing progress as evidence to show that we can be hopeful. What has been the existing progress under the rule of left-wing parties? It has looked like parties that cater to the luxury beliefs but at the top. Under the Obama administration, for example, the strong push for affirmative action has meant that they care more about rich black folks who could get into Harvard, definitionally the 0.01%, rather than ordinary black people on the ground who struggle to learn algebra in schools, for example, because public are underfunded. It is things like focusing on decolonializing the names of plants, rather than ensuring you increase funding to public schools and ensure that you detract math to help individuals. So the glorifying of the existing progress that you have is existing progress that helps elites at the top, people who will vote for left-wing parties on both sides of the house. So what you need to care about is the working class, for whom there is no track record of success. Second response, they say that they could talk about this as well. So I'll also play the word trick, right? We can also talk about some solutions on our side of the house. Clearly, this debate is not totally mutually exclusive. It's about finding the right balance. Third claim they say you're more likely to unify all of the left. First, I want to flip this. Given I've explained to you why the problem is something that is more likely to be supported by every individual rather than minute solutions, they introduce more divisions. Contrary to the example of Mamdani, I actually want to look at the actual left-wing politicians who have been able to get into power in the past. It's people like Raphael Warnock, for example, who campaigned on the fact that all of the discrimination you see in the workplace, for example, goes against civil liberties, which libertarians on the right should care about. It's people like Bernie Sanders, for example, who first campaigned and got into the Senate because he said that American interventions in Chile tanked its economy and was a bad thing. These are pessimistic narratives that are far more unifying than the specific solutions they want to talk about. I know what they're going to say. stand for a broad kind of solution, but this cuts all of the benefits because the reason they say focusing on solutions is good is because it is granular. Before I move on, sure.
Why would people whose lives are terrible right now not listen to optimism as a fresh change to the current narratives that exist?
Because there's no proof for them that this optimism will succeed. You seem to believe that people will blindly believe what the left-wing party says. If Trump tells me and accurately describes what is happening to my life, I believe that this party is in touch with my life. On your side of the house, you believe that this left-wing party only listens to the urban rich within places like, New York City. This came by unifying the left is symmetric, yeah? So, because on our side of the house, all of the messaging will be about, issues if we really have to stand for it. So this is a non-claim. Second question then, in terms of the type of change that you're actually able to do. I want to point out here that this is an independent path to victory. I've already explained why, given it is so hard to change, even if you can change, what you do on their side of the house is you'll not see the fruition of this hope. So it will be basically empty hope on their side of the house. Here's why I want to extend the margins. Why are impacts so important? We explain why the people who capture hopeful messaging on their side are going to push for things that are going to mean that left-wing parties do not get into power. Things like not going for strategic voting, for example, which is very important given that you face a pressing threat of the right-wing getting into power. It is important for people to have low expectations to begin with to allow for more compromise to happen. What is the weighing for this? Because I think First Prop says at the end of his speech that they care about a few big changes rather than lots of small changes. First, these big changes will get reversed on their side of the house. That is when hope is more likely to be sapped. Because when you're promised, for example, that this rent freeze will carry on for 10 years, and then you realize it gets hijacked by a city council that is Republican, that is when you lose hope on their side of the house. Second, sustained changes are far more diffuse. We should not concentrate the benefits of a few big changes on the urban rich. A lot of the policies we described, food stamps, for example, carried out across the board, help more individuals who are more vulnerable. For all of these reasons, we are very proud to post.
We'd like to thank the second up for the remarks, continuing their prop. Prop, all good.
Yeah, one sec. Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Yeah. Panel, look around you at what right-wing governments throughout the world has been doing. There have been gutting of federal institutions because they make people believe that they're too far gone to save. They cut things like the Department of Education in the US because there is a lot of pessimistic rhetoric around it, thinking that it is too far gone and useless and not capable of saving, which is why we need to eradicate it the whole. On their side, you would have the left wing agree with the right wing. You would have them reinforce the bad policies that they want to implement as a response to the pessimistic rhetoric. I think on their side, they deeply underestimate the power of a dream, because that is something that gives people something to look forward to, that gives people something to wake up to, hoping that things can change in the future, hoping that they might have a future that is worth living. We think that was the most powerful rhetoric that mobilizes people on a far stronger and meaningful level on our side. Two clashes then in the speech. First, on what side can you mobilize more people? Second, on what side can you get more meaningful change? On the first clash then, on what side can you mobilize people, more people? The first thing I want to prove at the top of this clash is why hope is a far powerful rhetoric to mobilize people than cynicism. The first thing to say is that it gives people something to gain.
Point of
Let's just say
information.
psychologically, not right now. That is to say, psychologically, people are self-interested. They want to invest their time and efforts into something that they think they can gain. That is why they do things like, that is why people in general do things like take risks in order to multiply their capital over time. When you tell them there is something that you can genuinely gain, that a problem that you're facing right now has a way to fix itself later on, that is the instances in which they feel
Point
it
of
is far
information.
more feasible for them to actually get up and do things like protest against it. But second, we tell you that politicians tell them there is something to fight for. And historically, aspirational nature of change has been motivating for people. And that is crucially because of two reasons. The first reason is that these rhetoric is often things like you don't need to be happy about current events. You don't have to be complacent around it. That things can change for the better. That there are certain solutions that you can implement that can better your situation right now. And on their side, on the comparative, when people acknowledge the fact that things are difficult and when there are no politicians that are actually telling them there are things that you can do to evolve and change them, they grow complacent in the negative perception they have of the world around them. But secondly, panel, look at history and the amount of revolutionary wars and the way in which they were fought. They did acknowledge that things were bad right now, that you needed, for example, to fight against authoritarian regimes and bad governments. But what they did not do was tell them there is no way in which their country could be safe. What they did do instead is bring up an aspirational nature to the governments. That there are instances in which there are the things that you can do to change the way in which you're living right now. And we think that is the single most important thing that drives people up to the streets and do things like protest. Second thing I want to deal with in this clash is how does the right wing actually use pessimism on their side? We think they use rhetorics like the principles of democracy as it stands today are failing. That certain institutions are far too corrupt to let them live. And that is what has led to things like job cuts in federal institutions like USAID. In case of the disbanding of institutions like the Department of Education. Why were the Republicans able to generate support for this? Because they thought that things like democratic backsliding, they're going away with institutions that are causing problems right now was the only solution that you could have to deal with it. So on the best case, even if pessimism does lead to solutions, we told you these are inherently bad policies that gives even more power to the right wing. Why is this? The first, it is because you agree with the right. You villainize institutions that they're meant to protect on our side. Because on their side, you basically acknowledge to the right wing's rhetoric. There are institutions that have been failed and are corrupted, and the only way to deal with them is to do away with them. We think this was extremely problematic on their side. But the second thing I want to respond to is them saying, is them saying that people won't join the left-wing politics because they think it is too out of reach. First, we're unsure why they were so unreasonable as to say that we won't recognize the problems that the voter bases are going through in the first place. Because let's be logical about it. In order to be hopeful towards something, you have to know what is wrong in the first place. And we think this is something that politicians will probably do on our side as well. But we think it is probably far more representative for you to say that there is something you can actually do to change the problems you're going through, instead of saying that those problems are too far gone and the only thing that you can do is like take institutions out of the road. We think this was extremely problematic on their side. And look, the weighing of this argument is simple because let's take them at their best. Either side can generate engagement. Why then is the form of engagement we generate far more consistent and able to lie on a far larger duration? The issue is when on our side, when you get smaller wins, that is positive reinforcement. You think that things are not as bad and you can change nothing in the political system to make it better. You get confirmation there is something that you can do to change it. So even if it is a small court victory, for example, or a small social movement getting some amount of change, you think the world is not so far gone that you don't have that for example, you don't engage with it at all. Second, on that, a large amount of negative rhetoric. Even if you get small wins, you think the political system is too far gone. You think the political system is so bad, these small wins actually changes nothing on your side. Which is why they de-engage with the movement in general. But second, in the instance that you don't get change, that is even more reinforced for them to believe that the political system is really bad, and you do things like stop going to vote, like stop engaging with the political system in a far more meaningful manner. We think at best, they might get certain amount of engagement driven by fear and outrage. They run out of it far too early on their side. On our side, we can guarantee you consistent change, which can actually sustain meaningful support on our side. Before I move on to my second argument,
do people trust left-wing parties?
Current currently, I think they don't trust like left-wing parties, but those are the exact reasons as to why you have to do things that over-exaggerate on their victories. Give them reasons to trust these left-wing parties in the first place. The fact that they have been successful in certain fields and that their support can actually change something within the party means that you need a counterbalancing force to the current cynicism that exists in the world right now. You need to show them that the left-wing party is capable of change, is capable of making their lives better, and that is the only way you can do that is by having things like hopeful rhetoric on our side. Second, then, on what side do you get more meaningful change? And listen, here is the clash where I actually want to analyze the kind of changes that you can get on either side if engagement is guaranteed. First, on their side, the kinds of changes that you get, as I said, are mostly things like right-wing parties telling you these institutions are so bad that you cannot solve them. But second, I quickly want to respond to that thing on like realistic expectations and why people opt out worse because they think that the promises that were made were too far-reaching. First, I don't think this is true insofar as we tell you that we can guarantee still small victories. Look at Zoran Mamdani, for example. He might have promised things like rent freezes, but he's still doing things like bettering infrastructure and like filling out roads, for example, or decreasing the deficit budget that NYC had in this instance. We think these small victories are what people are what things that are able to sustain people within these changes. But second, on their side, you basically get nothing at the point at which you are floating like voters towards right-wing parties that the kind of change that they do like have on their side are things that like worsen the current institutions in which the political system operates in and entrenches right-wing power within them. And look at the impact of this. On their side, you have right-wing parties gaining more traction, gaining more acknowledgement of the fact that these institutions are far worse. And currently, as both sides agree, right-wing parties are in power to a far larger extent. You give them ammo to double down on things like democratic backsliding that over time makes left-wing politicians and makes the left-wing far more weaker to actually get in power or get any kind of meaningful change on their side. So the way for this argument is simple. Given the current context of the world, you give ammo to right-wing parties to double down on things like democratic backsliding that makes long-term change of future aspirations of the left-wing party and gut it right from the bottom. For all these reasons, we're so proud to propose.
Great. Thank you so much for the fine remarks coming from third prop. Continuing, I think, welcome third up.
There is a severe intellectual hubris on the side of proposition to suggest that the right is fundamentally wrong. We think the fact that many people have shifted towards policies from the right does indicate that some people do believe that the left has failed them in many regards. To therefore suggest that we must completely not co-opt any of the strategies the right has used, that has consistently developed them victories across the world, I think is hubris that cost the left at previous elections in the past. I want to be very clear on what is our stance. To be clear, on paper, they claim to suggest that they do agree that the left has failed people and people don't trust the left. But I want to note, the logic of their case goes against this. For you to believe their case, you have to believe that the left currently owns the trust of people, and therefore the left is able to make very big claims to capitalize on this trust. What we tell you is far more nuanced. We recognize that the left has in the past failed people. It has asked people to trust the system, and the system has continued to fail them. As a result of this, given a climate of low trust right now, which is what they supposedly claim to support, that all the more suggests that you need to go through very small expectations to recognize that you have failed in the past, to recognize that the system is fundamentally flawed, and you're willing to make overarching changes as a whole. Two themes in this speech. First, on whether or not we mobilize change. Second, on the types of change we get. Before that, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. I want to get rid of this strange claim they continuously make that in our world, you will not be able to talk about any solutions at all. Obviously, if you buy their own analysis that you can talk about some problems in their world because you need to foreground your solutions, I think it is very obvious politicians would do the same in our world. You would maybe heavily emphasize the problems you're talking about, but obviously you need to posit a positive version of how you would solve that problem. I want to know, what are the examples of this? And I think they severely limit this debate to the US, and I only want to talk about Zoran Mamdani. Let's broaden our view to look at other leftist politicians across the world. It probably looks like the messaging that Lula used in Brazil, arguing against Bolsonaro at the threat that the second term by him would lead to a full authoritarian term. It looks like the NPF in France, for instance, which used this strategy in order to defeat Le Pen's party. What this suggests then is that it is deeply unclear outside will not get any talk about solutions. Even if you buy this as a significant trade-off, what we prove to you is that focusing more on problems is on net better than focusing more on solutions. First theme then, who better mobilizes change? Under this, I want to talk about two things. First, who mobilizes people on the left? Second, who mobilizes people on the right or your swing voters? First, who mobilizes people on the left? The broad frame we introduced to you from the start is that the vast majority of the people on the ground right now in the left are deeply cynical of the system and distrusting. I want you to note, they completely agree with this. Down all their speakers, they have conceded that this is probably the case. I want to contextualize this a bit more. We think the left has tried this very pro-hope messaging in the past. It was supercharged by what we saw in huge successes by Obama, and therefore the Democrat Party used this as a blueprint going forward for their campaigns in Clinton and Harris and whatnot. Empirically, we know that things like Harris's Joy campaign failed significantly, and that the only instances where the Democrat Party has broken away from this system, in the instance of Joe Biden arguing that Trump's second term would destroy democracy, were the instances where it saw its biggest amount of successes. I want you to remember this because this is important. They say people on the ground are currently in pain and they want hope. The point is, the left has tried this messaging before. It has promised them hope in the past and not delivered anything. We think a return to this strategy again will only lead to all the same problems later on. Even if I know they do agree with this framing, even if you want specific reasons, I think we do give this to you. One, many people are pissed off by identity politics. People have been very affected by the rise of cancel culture. Second, neoliberalism has meant many of jobs have shifted away and offshore to other countries, and people on the ground lose jobs. Third, people are quite pissed off by the significant degree of immigration happening and no longer buy the suggestion that all immigration is good. Given that it is the case that, as they agree, people on the ground are deeply cynical, why does it suggest that parties need to match this cynicism rather than trying to be hopeful? One, because that's the only way to talk about issues they care about. We think the rise of the right for years has been because the right was the only party willing to say that you are not crazy for thinking that globalization has harmed you on the ground. You are not crazy for believing that allowing maximum amounts of immigration, as was done during the refugee crisis in Germany, are things that are not a priori good. What this suggests is that the only way you're able to contradict previous messaging, the only way you're able to recognize that you have failed as a party in the past, is through being able to take a pessimistic approach towards your current stances and recognizing that change must occur. Second, we think adopting this cynicistic approach, if everyone else is cynical, is the only way to gain authenticity. If you on the ground feel as though the system has failed, you will only believe that your candidates are authentic, that they speak to the issues that you really care about, if they're willing to also agree that the system has been failing and change needs to occur. The only response we get to this is this broad claim that you'll not be able to focus on any issues at all, and only in Dagwood they can talk about solutions. Barring the fact that I've already proved to you why this is completely symmetric if you buy it, I want to flip this. Even if you buy that issues are going to be overwhelmingly focused on in our world, why is this a better trade-off to take? One, we think this is significantly more unifying across the left. I want to note, the problem in their case is they treat the left or the left party as a complete monolith. But what we've seen in the US, what we've seen in the UK and whatnot, is that the left is incredibly large spectrum between progressives, between centrists. What we tell you is that we are better able to unify. The reason this is the case is because people on various spectrums of the left might disagree about what is the correct solution, but they can still agree that a problem is the most important thing. You might disagree whether you should pursue rent controls or a more abundance-based agenda like decreasing zoning laws, but you can still agree that the housing affordability crisis is the most important issue. Given that the right currently holds power, we think the only way to get at least some degree of unity, to put at least one candidate in power, comes from unifying around broad problems rather than solutions, because that's what people are more able to agree on. Even if you don't buy all of that, that suggests on our world we are more able to unify people on the ground or people on the left. What is a deadlock breaker? This is the second theme here on why we are better able to mobilize the right or people in the center in general. Look, even if you buy that outside doesn't have a much meaningful change, we think the farthest or ardent supporters of the left are likely to stay with the left anyway. What is more important is the people within the center that the left has been bleeding out to the right for years. Why do we uniquely co-opt this? And the argument that we give you since second that goes unresponded to. One, people on the right are more likely to agree with the broad criticism you suggest. They're more likely to agree that the fundamental problems you identify are things that you ought to care about. Second, again, problems are far more unifying for these people. If you're on the right and you do believe that certain policies are the best way to approach a certain issue, we think it's very difficult for you to be convinced by a message of hope that advocates on that policy. But if you can recognize that some things like democratic backsliding is occurring, you can recognize things like affordability are huge issues, you're willing to shift to a leftist candidate that primarily talks about these issues, especially when they don't primarily concern themselves with a solution that you don't necessarily agree with. At the end of this then, I want to weigh this briefly. We think the left is currently massively bleeding support by many young men who are already in the center and shifting towards the right. If we want to make sure that the left can at least retain some people, to swing some people that has lost, this is by far the most important thing. At the end of this theme then, I think we quite clearly prove to you that the only metric they want to engage on in terms of who gets mobilization is cleanly won on our side. Second theme then on why we get better forms of change. Before that, sure.
If cynicism is being practiced by voters and by the right wing, and people are already being bombarded with all of these problems, why would you continue to do this?
Because it's effective. Like the claim we give you is the context. The left has tried this approach before. People are quite upset that what Kamala Harris promised on joy, what Hillary Clinton promised on all those things, even Obama promised on hope, have not come to fruition. What this suggests is that the thing we need now is change, a breach from the strategy that's consistently failed them. We think that's the side that we're able to achieve. Second theme then on the types of change. I want to know, don't really spend much time on this, so I'll spend less time on it. First, why do we get better policy as a whole? The broad claim they give us is you're more able to unify the leftist party as a whole. Again, we flip this. It is more unifying to talk about broad problems because those are the things you're going to get consensus on over solutions. I want to flip this even more. We think we get more ability to create change in two ways. One, once you get in power, you're far more able to make things like concessions or compromise within parliament. We think gridlock is a bad thing. You're more able to push for change when parties can broadly agree on the general problems that need to be solved. Second, we think we get more long-term change in general, things that we've got largely unresponded to. Even if you don't buy all of that, and if you buy the specific policy outcomes that are washed, what are the other independent benefits that we give you that go unresponded to? One, it means if you think that the political system is something that's deeply flawed, it means you're more likely to engage in grassroots activities if you think much can't be changed on a political system. It means you do things like more campaigning. It means you work with grassroots leaders. This is a benefit that goes uncontested. Second, we think it means you're more able to engage in things like strategic voting. Even if on the broader scale of things, you can't choose the president, maybe it means on the ground, you recognize that the message of hope from your third party, Green Party candidate is not going to be effective and you're willing to vote for the lesser evil if that leads to more change in the long term. What we prove to you is that the other side that meaningfully results in change for the leftist party, the strategy they have adopted for generations has failed. We need to make some change. We're very proud to oppose.
We'd like to thank third up for the final remarks. To continue and close up bench, I'd like to welcome opposition flag.
Look, I don't know when it genuinely became acceptable for the debate circuit to believe that the New York City and the United States is literally the world. The pet example of the proposition is Zohran Mamdani. Ironically, Zohran Mamdani was competing in a mayoral race, not against a plausible Republican candidate, but against a Democratic candidate from his own spectrum and wing of the political party. Clearly, this is the place where there's the lowest margin in the round. Even if Zohran Mamdani is marginally more progressive, the left is going to win the New York on either side of the House. What we explained to no response is that across the world, the places where right-wing populism is the most potent are places where lots of left-wing voters have been disillusioned by a left-wing party that was too elite, that was too neoliberal, and did not sympathize with the struggles of people on the ground. The rallying cry of this proposition is that we need to be aspirational. The proof for this is that is how every successful revolution led to change. Might I suggest to you that every successful revolution also had a lot of people backing a leader they trust. Gandhi was popular because he marched alongside ordinary Indian people from lower castes in the Salt March. Newsom is not on the ground with the Californian people who are unable to feed their children. Gavin Newsom is not the one who cannot attend schools that do not teach them proper math. These are instances where the left needs to gain the trust of voters. So how do they say they will convince people to remain aspirational? First, their third speaker for the first time says that there is positive reinforcement. Too bad for them, because their first speaker concedes that it is very hard for you to do change. Positive reinforcement requires a lot of sustained positive wins. If it is very hard for you to get a lot of sustained positive wins, might I suggest to you that you get negative reinforcement, because there are lots of bad things that happen to you and you believe that the left-wing party is lying to you. Second, in setup, and this is the only mechanization, they say there are things in the past that you can point to. Maybe it's the case that there are past track record you could point to, but the people who have swung to the right are those for whom the track record says nothing to them. Neoliberal policies do not help the ordinary black people who started voting for Trump because those policies didn't help these people on the ground. You pointing to a past track record reinforces a left-wing base that will support you anyway and not convince the people who have moved away from the left to continue supporting you. What is the comparative on our side of the house? We admit it is an uphill battle for the left. We are not saying that the kind of change we mobilize on our side of the house would mean you get progressive, utopic, communist heaven on all parts of the world. What we are saying is that on the margins, maybe it's the case that previously you stopped voting for the Democratic Party because you really didn't believe in what Kamala Harris says. Maybe you're more likely to start funding and donating your local council. So even if you don't vote, for example, for your constituency to turn blue, maybe you're voting for your local council to do this. Maybe it's the case, for example, that I'm still skeptical about the solutions that the Democratic Party is going to give. I'm maybe at least more willing to hear about these solutions because I believe that the Democratic Party knows about my struggles and is along there with them. So it's not pretty on our side of the house, but the point is it is possible for you to marginally shift whether or not people feel as though they want to mobilize change. Even if you believe that the extent to which we can mobilize more change on the of our side of the house is symmetric, the deadlock breaker for us to win this debate is about the type of change we give. The only thing they say is that solution-based changes are more important. But what kinds of solutions? They say they want a broad-based solution to unify the party. Maya suggests to you that what is counted as a broad-based solution will be a solution that doesn't target disenfranchised rural voters, for example. Maya suggests that is a solution that targets, for example, headline rates of GDP and not whether you reshore manufacturing to ensure ordinary people on the ground have jobs. These are solutions that do not speak to the interests of people on the ground. Second, we explain why you being too hopeful leads to things that hurt yourself. You don't engage in voting, so the right-wing party is always going to win because the left cannot unite. You don't, for example, turn to local councils because you believe voting in the political system is enough rather than doing other things that are outside the system. So it's an independent path to victory. For all of these reasons, we mobilize more change. Even if we don't, the type of change is more better on our side of the house. You must oppose.
We'd like to thank the opposition reply for the final remarks. To conclude the entirety of this round, I'd like to welcome government reply.
Perhaps we can all agree that there are problems in society, but I'm unclear on what just agreeing that there is a broad problem is doing. Perhaps there is a big issue with the democratic system, but at the end of the day, if people are fragmented because they have different solutions, we don't see why just pointing out the problem and getting unification was a good thing. Because then maybe people voted for you once, but when you really don't end up changing the system and like all you do is talk about the problem, people never voted for you again. That is what made people who voted for the left far more disillusioned. That is what made the world a far worse place in terms of the right wing gaining more control. The first thing I want to note is obviously both sides have solutions, but the degree to which you point out problems and give solutions is different. By virtue of their own concession, is just far more on our side of the house. But the first thing, and two clashes in this speech. First thing on like where do people just feel more validated and where does the messaging just be far more effective? The first thing that they say is that currently people on the ground feel disconnected with the left and their problems simply aren't validated. The way that you validate problems is not by saying, yes, here is a problem, but rather by telling them, yes, there is a problem, but there is also capacity to change. This is quite important because insofar as they just pointed out the problem and never told you how they would actually solve these problems that they point out, it was unclear to us how they were able to get people to vote in a sustainable manner. Perhaps they got one term or perhaps they got like two different terms, but the problem is still that they weren't able to get sustained engagement with the party because they weren't able to change anything. But the big thing that Punya tells you is that we are just far more effective because we tell people that there's something to gain. We tell people that these small wins are on the path to gain bigger wins, and these were the most effective ways to rally people onto the streets. But secondly, and the bigger claim that they have here is just that you're going to over glorify the politician, which means you will be quite disappointed when they don't fulfill literally everything. Firstly, if people are cynical and the messaging is hopeful, I just don't think people now suddenly fully think that this particular politician is our saving grace. It is likely that people still have critical thinking, so they will obviously call them out when the promises aren't being fulfilled. But secondly, this is good. If people are disappointed that the party is not fulfilling its promises, they have more pressure on them to go ahead and have better forms of policy. On the comparative, all you do is go ahead and do more blame game on the right, which never actually got any change in the first place. But secondly, then, speaking of change, I want to talk about where do you just get more change. The first thing that they say is that you need to be more open because in order for you to have any actual change to have hope. The first thing I want to note is just that if you're overly pessimistic about different parts of the system, things like healthcare, etc., it is unclear to us how you suddenly can create change using these very systems that you've talked bad about. But secondly, in order for you to be hopeful and in order for you to have hopeful rhetoric, you presumably will have to create change. That is when you are just far more likely to work with other left parties in order to have a common solution. But where does the left really regain trust? The first thing is just that on solutions, you just have more discourse about which is the better solution within the left itself. So even if there's some amount of fragmentation, at the end of the day, you are talking about the solution, whereas on their side, you do absolutely none of this. But secondly, you then push them to deliver the actual solution. This was just a good thing. But even in the worst case scenario, let us say that you are being cynical and the right wing is also being cynical. Like, just think about it. Then, if both parties are cynical, people end up moving more to the right because they have been cynical for the longer period of time and they don't see why you are any different. Perhaps you call the right out in the worst case scenario, but you're never able to prove why you are better than the right because you are never able to prove how you change these systems in the first place. So, even in their best case, the problem just ends up being that you were never actually able to prove that you are better than the right because you use the same cynical methods. This is just far worse, and this is what pushed people to vote for the right, which is why you need to vote for side proposition.
Okay. We'd like to thank Government Reply for the fine remarks that we of this round. Yeah, you can cast virtually and whatnot. We would like to encourage all participants and observers to exit the room immediately so the panel can